For this session, we have Georges Michelson-Dupont, who was born in Paris, France. He married Marlene, who is a reader of the Urantia book in 1971, and they have 2 grown daughters. George's father introduced him to the Urantia book in the early 1960s, and George was a member of the team which spent 15 years revising and correcting the French translation. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, as president of an association of French-speak readers, George organized several international conferences for readers of the Urantia book. George became a trustee of the Urantia Foundation in September of 1995, and in 1996 became the first president of the French Association of the Urantia Association International. Today, George is an international vice president of Urantia Foundation and a manager of translations. George, if you want to take it away, he will be discussing a liberating perspective on death.
First, I would like to thank the organizer for this video conference initiative. I think it is a very good opportunity when we are all confined to spend a nice time with old and new friends. I felt indeed the necessity to ponder about death and its meaning for my life, and also because many of my good friends graduate lately. So I felt the necessity to think about it. Also, all quotes presented in this video conference are from the Urantia book. The opinions and testimonials are mine and do not represent necessarily the view of Urantia Foundation, in which I have some responsibilities. Well, I will start the presentation with the phenomenon of death understood by human beings here on Urantia. And I shall continue with what our celestial instructors reveal about death and survival on evolutionary planet like Urantia. I will continue by reminding the 3 kinds of death and their consequences concerning personality survival, and a description of the spiritualization of our mind by our thought adjuster will follow, a process called supremacy by the authors of the book, leading to survival and beyond. Finally, we will terminate this presentation with the liberating power of faith in God, the result of the thought adjuster's work in our mind. Living faith is the antidote to all fear. And then I will conclude with a more personal conclusion, so to speak. So for human beings, the approach to death is experienced on 2 levels, the physical and which means suffering, physical suffering, and the psychic, the emotional anxiety. Generally speaking, physical suffering, whether due to an accident of life or early stage of death, is something inevitable, depending on the circumstances. Fortunately, there are medications to relieve, even suppress pain, thus becoming bearable. The psychic fear of dying is of a mind nature. It can therefore be controlled and calmed insofar as our point of view on death is enlightened by the truth and transcended by faith. The media coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic has exaggeratedly heightened fear of dying. The Urantia book brings a liberating perspective to this transition by placing it on a wider cosmic framework, which we shall revisit for around 30 minutes, followed by a debate during which we will share our testimonies. So the phenomenon of death on Urantia seen by human beings. The approach of death is anxiety-provoking for human beings. For many materialists, there is no survival. For others, immersed in material life, they don't even question the purpose of their life. But for religionists, it is a matter of faith. The way each of us approaches death is personal and depends essentially on our mind framework, where our inner life takes place, including our beliefs, our character, our education, our thinking process, and our scales of values. The main issue is the lack of information about life after death. It is enough to reveal the truth about death to radically change our perception of what it means for our life. Jesus proved proof of survival, his resurrection. A little over 2,000 years ago, Jesus came on Urantia to proclaim that believing in God, the Universal Father, is sufficient to resuscitate, and he demonstrated it. But the times were not ripe for a wider revelation about life after death. Today, it's clear that humanity needs an epochal revelation to escape from the tautology in which it finds itself in order to bring clarity and certainty for the believers. The phenomenon of death on evolutionary worlds revealed by our celestial authors or instructors. Truly, death is not an end. It is a transition from one stage to another, from one status to another. Yet it is an obligatory passage. It allows mortal man to pursue his career of progressive divinization by obeying the divine command, be you perfect in your sphere as I am perfect in mine, or as the Father is perfect in his. For this end, the paradise deities have developed a divine plan of progress intended to advance by evolution material beings of time toward perfection of eternity. What a program. The Universal Father bestows a personality with free will and a thought adjuster to guide material beings in safety and eternity by fusion. The eternal Son and the Paradise Creator Sons bestow the Father's love upon mankind. They incarnate as human of the realms and reveal the personality of the Universal Father. By their exemplary life in the flesh, they exhibit the full and entire realization of the divinity of will, the perfection of motivation of personality, and God consciousness. And also, the Infinite Spirit implements the plan of the Father and the Son through the universal ministry of mercy. He is the joint executive of the two, as the divine counselor states, and I quote, "Having promulgated the universal mandate, be you perfect even as I am perfect, the Father entrusted the execution of this tremendous undertaking to the Eternal Son. And the Eternal Son shares the fostering of this supernal enterprise with his divine coordinate, the Infinite Spirit. Thus, do the deities effectively cooperate in the work of creation, control, evolution, revelation, ministration, and if required, in restoration and rehabilitation. The divine disposition is referred in the book as the divine perfection plan. It gives religionists and believers the unshakable certainty that the deities have set up a mechanism for the perfection of creatures whose death is only the prelude. But what death are we talking about? While human beings recognize only one kind of death, verily there are three, because human beings is made up of three realities: the material, the intellectual, and the spiritual. And under certain circumstances, which description will follow, each of the three realities can meet death in reality. Spiritual death of the soul, it is when a mortal rejects survival, when he is declared spiritually insolvent. From the cosmic point of view, the concerned person is already dead, and the inner adjuster definitively leaves his human host, even if the vital energies are still at work. The mystery monitor will not be present at the resurrection of the personality. Then the intellectual death, the mental death. It is when a degenerative brain disease or the destruction of the brain occurs, causing the person concerned to be unable to make spiritual choices. Although physical life, presumably vegetative, can continue until physical death, the inner adjuster temporarily leaves the individual until he returns when his host is in the resurrection hall. And the physical death, of course, it is when the vital energy is exhausted. The body ceases to live along with the mind. The adjusters take with him the spiritual memory and all the mental processes of his host. He will be present in the resurrection hall when the individual will resurrect. I think we all want to avoid spiritual death, and for sure, in some extent, the intellectual one. But the revelation brings a new meaning to death. It is the prelude to an endless career of intellectual and spiritual progress, an ever greater appreciation of the love of the universal Father for his children, and an understanding of the infinite wisdom manifested through his plan of individual progression for human beings. Again, let's integrate death into our new and expanded conceptual framework as an inevitability of the Father's supreme government, a part of his ascension plan. And I quote, "Is courage, strength of character desirable? Then must man be reared in an environment which necessitates grappling with hardships and reacting to disappointment." With this mechanism of progression, the divine plan is referring to, and how do we escape from spiritual death? The mind arena of choice. Personality survival, subsequent fusion with our thought adjuster, and time-space perfection is not an automatic process. It requires our wholehearted adhesion to God's plan. The destiny of the grand universe is perfection, and the Supreme Being will emerge in sovereignty because the final space-time cycle is foreordained. The process is teleological, meaning that it originates in eternity and in infinity in God's mind. We are a tiny part of this universe, but in the eyes of the Supreme, we are co-creators of his emergence. Therefore, our destiny is linked, and we must choose to participate in this grandiose adventure. Our choice is optional, personal, and experiential. In practice, the unique alternative is, are our daily choices guided by the desire to actually do the will of God and to embrace the universal career, or are our daily choices more and more identify with matter and finally undergo the extension of our personality? That is the question. This decision mechanism process takes place in our mind, as confirmed by a solitary messenger from Orvonton. Material mind is the arena in which human personalities live, are self-conscious, make decisions, choose God or forsake him, eternalize or destroy themselves. At this point of the discussion, we should remember about the definition of mind. Mind, the thinking, perceiving, and feeling mechanism of the human organism, the total conscious and unconscious experience, the intelligence associated with the emotional life, reaching upward through worship and wisdom to the spiritual level. And our mind is a mechanism for the resolution of tension between matter and spirit, the subordination of matter to the dominance of the spirit through the mediation of mind by the decision of personality as follows. Remember that physical systems are subordinate, that intellectual systems are coordinate, that personality is superordinate, and the indwelling spiritual forces is potentially directive. It is to say that, finally, personality uses mind to coordinate matter, the material ego, with spirit, the thought adjuster, through an evolutionary process of interassociation, matter, mind, spirit, integration, progressive submission of matter to the guiding spirit by the choices of the personality in the mind area, ending with unification with the thought adjuster. So interassociation, integration, and unification, this is the process. The authors of the papers call this process supremacy. This work of interassociation, integration, and unification call for a process of mind spiritualization. What does spiritualization mean? How do we submit our material ego to the divine guidance? The divine counselors gives an explanation in these terms. In the inner experience of mind, mind is joined to matter. Such material-linked minds cannot survive mortal death. The technique of survival is embraced in those adjustments of the human will and those transformations in the mortal mind whereby that a God-conscious intellect gradually becomes spirit-taught and eventually spirit-led. The adjustment of the human will and the transformation in the mortal mind. What does it mean? It is a process of gradual transfer from egoist self-consciousness to God consciousness. It takes place when human beings wholeheartedly accept the progressive supremacy of spiritual ideals inspired by the thought adjuster over selfish choices in daily life and the intense desire to do the will of the Father. And I quote, when thought adjusters indwell human minds, they bring with them the model careers, the ideal lives, as determined and foreordained by themselves and the personalized adjuster of Divinington, which have been certified by the personalized adjuster of Urantia. Thus, they begin work with a definite and predetermined plan for the intellectual and spiritual development of their human subject. But it is not incumbent upon any human being to accept this plan. You are all subject of predestination, but it is not foreordained that you must accept this divine predestination. You are at full liberty to reject any part of all of the thought adjusters program. It is their mission to effect such mind changes and to make such spiritual adjustments as you may willingly and intelligently authorize, to the end that they may gain more influence over the personality directionalization. But under no circumstance do these divine monitors ever take advantage of you or in any way arbitrarily influence you in your choices and decisions. The adjusters respect your sovereignty of personality. They are always subservient to your will. This is just incredible. God submits a fragment of himself to the will of human beings. Our human ego is of animal origin, with its heredity tendencies. Its more or less legitimate claims according to their nature and the satisfaction of our vital needs of life. The quality of our mind frame depends on our inheritance, our education, and the culture in which we grew up. The adjuster must therefore work to spiritualize with the mind he has at his disposal. It is clear that when our mind is encumbered with prejudices, fears, misinformation, or ignorance, it makes his work very, very difficult. The goal of the fifth epochal revelation is precisely to clarify confusions, expand our cosmic consciousness, and enhance our spiritual perception. The more our mind framework is illuminated by the truth of facts, the more the adjuster is able to facilitate the emergence of new meanings in our daily experience, thus enriching our life and raising our scales of value. Again, that is mind spiritualization. Therefore, with this new unending and eternal life perspective, death becomes something positive and sometimes almost desirable in certain circumstances. This reminds me of a discussion I had 20 years ago with my friend Richard Keeler, the night before his heart surgery by Professor Carpentier at Georges Pompidou Hospital in Paris. He was a bit anxious, and I felt necessary to make a soft joke. I said to him, let's compare death with a river and your operation, a bridge crossing that river. Tomorrow, depending on the result of your operation, you might wake up on this side of the river or on the other side, depending on the success of your operation. So you will be still alive since you believe in life after death. Don't panic. You are lucky. It's a win-win situation. I believe this little joke helped him to think positively about his situation. Richard had a living faith in God. In real life, facing death, it takes faith to transform an intellectual approach into a serene experience. And I would say faith is the antidote of fear of dying. And I quote, "It is only natural that mortal man be harassed by feelings of insecurity when he sees himself inextricably linked to nature, when he has spiritual powers that completely transcend all temporal and finite things. Only religious trust, living faith, can sustain man in the midst of these difficult and disturbing problems." Is faith the supreme assertion of human thought desirable? Then must the mind of man find himself in that troublesome predicament where it ever knows less than it can believe. Well, where does faith come from, and how can we develop it? Faith takes place in our mind. It originates in the presence of our thought adjuster, who produces three experiential phenomena. One, the intellectual capacity to know God, the conscious of God. Two, the spiritual impulse to find God, the search for God. And three, the personality's intense desire to be like God, the sincere desire to do the will of God. This spiritual dynamic for searching God gives rise to faith in us, an increasing confidence in his goodness, in his divinity, that is to say, in his love, his mercy, and his service to his creatures. The progressive discovery of the magnificence of his progression plan, of the friendly cosmos he created, of his unconditional love for each creature, leads us to adore him, to do his will with all our heart. Thus, spiritual faith liberates us from fear, because we realize that every step is prepared ultimately for the good, even if there are difficult inevitabilities to come across. And I quote, "Through religious faith, the soul of man is revealed and demonstrates the potential divinity of his emergent nature by the characteristic way in which it incites the mortal personality to react to certain intellectually and socially trying situations. she displays an unexplainable balance and restorative tranquility despite baffling illness and even acute physical suffering. She continues, faith, to show an indomitable faith in the survival of the soul, regardless of the deceptive teachings of false science or the persuasive illusion of a specious philosophy. Living faith, that is to say, the dynamic faith, progressing by experience from self-awareness to the conscience of God, is really the antidote to the fear of dying. To wholeheartedly believe in survival must be definitely integrated once for all in our conceptual framework of life. It is essential for our psychic and emotional balance. The most beautiful example of faith in God is that of Jesus. And I quote, Jesus had a sublime and sincere faith in God. He experienced the ordinary ups and downs of mortal existence, but never religiously questioned the certainties of God's vigilance and guidance. His faith was the fruit of clairvoyance, born from the activity of the divine presence, the inner adjuster. His faith was neither traditional nor simply intellectual. It was entirely personal and purely spiritual. Peace in the present life, survival in death, perfection in the next life, service in eternity, all this is accomplished in spirit, right now, when the created personality consents to, choose to, submit the will of the Creator to the will of the Father. As for the Father, he has already chosen to subordinate a fragment of himself to the will of the Creator's personality. I shall conclude. On a more personal note, I recently went through a difficult period with 2 surgeries in a row following a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. When I awake after the second surgery, and despite the physical pain, I was truly serene and at peace. I felt myself immersed in his loving care. And as a matter of fact, I was happy to go through this ordeal because I was with my companion, my thought adjuster. My faith in the love of our universal Father, the certainty of survival, and my confidence in his divine plan of progression ascent helped me a lot to accept suffering. It is difficult to describe with words, but those who went through a similar experience will understand what faith may and can do. When my wife came and visited me, she saw me crying, but I was not crying because of suffering. I was crying because I was happy. I felt the love of God in my heart, in my soul, and I was completely under his care. So this is what I experienced. The approach of our death or the death of loved one is an opportunity which is given to us to talk about this taboo subject with tact and kindness to those around us, to offer them a new perspective, full of hope, which might give more meaning to their life. And this is what my wife and me and I did when her mother died. The whole family was gathered in the church. And after the ceremony, we had a family meal, and with 2 or 3 of my brother-in-law, I started to speak about life after death. And one came after and told me, but where do you get all those information? And I told him, and I said, well, I am interested in knowing more about it. So I encourage you, when there is that kind of opportunity, to speak frankly, because it is the truth. And the truth is, and telling the truth is never bad for somebody. So thank you for listening. And if you have some testimonies, or if you have some questions, or if you want to share your own experience with near death, just start now. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question.
George, it's Bobby.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi, Bobby.
That was
Nice to see you.
Thank you. You too.
I'm so happy to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciated what you had to say, and I'd like to share with everyone. Many of you knew my husband Steve, who died about 2 weeks ago of the coronavirus, and may have heard this from me. I've shared it, but miraculously, our son was able to be with him in the hospital, and he was with him the night that he was with him constantly, but the night that Steve died, Steve said to our son Mark, he said, I'm kind of tired. I'm going to take a little rest now, and when I wake up, I'll either see you or I'll be someplace else. And about 3 hours later, Mark called me and he said, I think this is it, Mom. I think he's on his way. And I heard Steve breathe his last breath, and Mark and I cried together. But I think Steve gave a gift to Mark that was so incredible, because Mark has never really been particularly interested in spiritual things. He's a wonderful young man. But I think his father, in his last hours, gave him the gift of the reality of spirit, because Mark, who's an emergency room doctor, said in the 4 or 5 days he was with Steve talked about going on, and he said he never saw anyone pass so peacefully from life to death as Steve did. So I just wanted to share that. And I have felt really, really emboldened in talking to people about life after death, having experienced this. And I feel just so enveloped by love and the experience of spiritual reality, knowing that he's on this adventure, and he's gone to meet so many of our friends who have gone before. I'm sure I'll leave some out, but among the people I see here, I know he's seeing Dave Elders and Charlie Olivier and Avi Dagim, and I don't want to leave anybody out. It's been a very ripe harvest for the personalities on Mansion World 1, and I hope the group of beautiful personalities who are gathering there are gonna help bring some light and love to this planet in this terrible time. Anyway, it's wonderful being here with you all. Thank you, Chris and Alice, for creating this wonderful opportunity. And just thank you, George. That was really great. Thanks.
Follow my dear sister. And I'll speak about the amazing opportunities in moments of crisis or in moments of transition. And for myself and for my family, with Dave crossing, there were many responses that really ran the whole gamut, from horror and panic and how are you going to possibly do this, to how lucky he is, you must be envious. And what I can say, I won't talk about the being held, which is very much part of the process, but I will talk about the opportunity to live in the truth of what we know. And in designing the celebration of his life, we had Urantia books around, and I used Urantia quotes in various things, and people spoke to it, but it was a very open forum and a very rich opportunity to not just know what comes next, but to be living from that knowledge in a much more, it wasn't about his death, it was more the of his death. And I probably had more people who are far removed from an interest in pursuing spiritual realities at this point in their lives. They have rich spiritual experiences. They attend churches and synagogues and so forth and so on, and they're very satisfied in that. But there's something in the living of the knowing about death that just puts a seed in their experience, because what we know and what we can live is so different from the consciousness on the planet about what comes next. So I really encourage each of us, when we're having conversations about death, or when we think we want to respect someone other's belief system, to drop into our own knowing and share that truth, because it is a truth that's transformational. And these people, certainly the ones I'm thinking of, they have rich faith lives. It's not like they don't live that and they're not good believers, but they don't know. And as George was speaking in his presentation, which, thank you, George, it was lovely. As he was speaking in that, it's the what truth offers. And we need both. We need the expanded cosmic consciousness and the enhanced spiritual perception. And our knowing increases and enhances the cosmic consciousness. And it can be such a gift.
Thank you, Martha. Anyone else? Yes, Marianne. Nice to see you here.
Nice to see you, George, and all of you. When you were speaking about Rich, I just wanted to share, and many of you may know this already, but he had a long, slow exit, and he was surrounded by good friends, and his daughter Libby got there just in time, you might say. And Rich was unconscious. And when she was there by his bed, he came to, and they sang together. I believe it was a Native American chant that they both knew, and said goodbye and kissed goodbye. And then Richard exited. And that is so typical of Rich. He's such a comedian, and he was such a great friend and a really dear friend of mine. And just to hear of his last moment, that his daughter got to be with him, I was just so thrilled. I thought that was just one of the best deathbed stories I'd ever heard. That's all I wanted to say. I'm dying to go. We're all dying to go there to the mansion world. So, and we'll all see each other, and we'll be in class learning all the things that we still have questions about. That's what I'm looking forward to, because I still have some questions. So anyway, thank you, George. It's so good to see you.
Any other comment?
Luis?
Thanks, Chris. Hi, George. Thank you so much for a
Hi,
deep
Luis.
and beautiful presentation. I just wanted to share one little thing. As many of you know, my brother, my mother passed away late 2018, and the journey to that passing was a beautiful one, where she had been hospitalized for several months, exposed to a lot of suffering, not this like the suffering that many people are experiencing today with the coronavirus, because she actually suffered 2 pneumonias and a lung thrombosis at the age of 73 that she actually survived. And sadly died of another reason related to one fall and so forth. But along the way, I realized 2 things. One was that when we really come together and give the best of our spiritual capacity and our compassion and our love to people that are suffering, there is incredible ways in which the forces that are within those efforts and the spiritual forces around us join us in a great journey of companionship and sharing that can bring life forward. And so she was able to survive after almost 3 months in hospital because of not only the love of my brother and I and the greater family, but a lot of the nurses and support people that were around her, that when I counted, there were around 12, 13 people that were supporting her. And that was extraordinary. So I wanted to share that beautiful network of souls that are working together to provide support to life. And that is a beautiful thing to do. And related to that and to her passing and the suffering that she experienced, and this is totally related to what you talked about, George, is that one of the things I realized as part of the suffering during her illness and then her passing during grief is that they are good mechanisms to embrace in our lives, that suffering and grief and sadness and all the different emotions that accompany disease and the loss of life and death, beyond what we already know and talked about a great detail with regards to the spiritual aspects and the supreme aspects that help us rejoice, and even wanting to get to that point. That I also share Marianne's perspective of being ready and wanting to die, not today, but when it's God's will. It is positive and fruitful to embrace the suffering and the grief that we experience, the emotions that we experience, because they will bring the legacy of those that are passing to become alive in us, and to be able to take them forward and share them with people as we face opportunities to help them. As you say, George, if you see a person that is suffering, that is confronted with the terminal illness of a friend or a relative, or even when we are in that position ourselves, those tools are there to serve us. And spiritualizing our response to all those feelings by embracing them wholeheartedly and knowing that they are also part of the plan of what we are is beautiful and highly constructive. Thank you for listening, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Luis.
By the way, there was somebody from Nairobi that made a question on the chat. George, do you want me to read it to you?
Yes.
He says, I'm in a noisy environment, so I will not use audio, but I have a question on reincarnation, or the idea of multiple lives in Urantia. Does this happen, or do we only have one transition into the Urantia worlds?
Is that a question for me? Well, it is a delicate topic, because I know that many people believe in reincarnation, but when you read carefully the introduction of paper 112, they stated that it is here on Urantia that your life begins. And then the next stage is on the mentioned world. So instead of reincarnation, and I've been discussing this topic with many people, and I do remember one topic we discussed with Bob Salone when we were in, I think it was in Brazil a long time ago. Someone came with the question of, but I believe in reincarnation, he said, and he was reading the book. And I told him, why you don't use the term repersonalization instead of reincarnation? That might help you. But definitely paper 112 is very clear about that. So that's, but it is, I confess, it is difficult. It is a difficult topic to address when someone is convinced that reincarnation is the process for becoming better and better. It is a process for progression. Yes, Marianne?
I'd like to share something. It was a personal experience, and it's been very helpful for me when I do talk to other people about reincarnation, because I did come from an Eastern philosophy background and believed in reincarnation until I got to the paper on the nature of the soul. And I was reading that night and went, well, this is interesting. This doesn't really make sense to me. So I said a prayer before I went to sleep. And I said, okay, God, I want to understand this. Please help me to understand about reincarnation. And here's what happened. I was in a Mansion World classroom, and there was a teacher, and there was a big white board. I think it was blue, actually. And she had a pointer. And the pointer became a visual graphic. She would make, like, it made a drawing. And she drew a picture of a woman's uterus and the seed coming down the fallopian tube. And she said, think of this seed as the mind and the personality. And then she had the man's organ come in and fertilize that seed and said, think of that as the thought adjuster, as the spirit of God fertilizing that seed. And now you have this embryo growing, and it's neither the mind of man, the personality of man, nor the spirit of God. It's a whole new entity. It's a growing, living entity. Think of that as a macrocosm, macrocosm, I always get those two confused. A microcosm of what's going on with the soul and the spirit. And that baby, that embryo will grow inside until it's born 9 months later, and then it comes out. And she turned to the class and she said, how many of you have ever seen a baby go into the womb of the mother? And it was an enlightening moment, because I understood that the soul cannot go back into the womb of our being here on this planet. And I woke up immediately, and I never believed in reincarnation again. And it was just such a gift, because I was so attached to that idea, having read the autobiography of a yogi and all that other books. And so I wish I could make a video of what I saw. But that's the reality, is that if you talk with people, they have to understand that they are growing their own soul, and that this mind body that we're in is the womb, and nobody's going back into it. Amen. I hope it helped.
Thank you, Mary. And yes, and I would like to read something that Brenda von Gelder sent, and it's a quote from the book. A mortal never returns to his native planet during the dispensation of his temporal existence. And if he should return during a subsequent dispensation, he would be escorted by a transport seraphim of the Universe Headquarters Group.
Feel free to keep talking, but it is break time, so we'll be starting a new session at the top of the hour. If you need to take a break, go take it now.